It's an honor to be here today for this celebration, and I'd like to thank the organizers of the event, first of all, and people that put this session together, and Principal Mark Vesey. My talk is Canadian Cosmopolitan, Mapping the Intellectual and Geographic Mobility of George Woodcock. My position right now is very much between worlds as well. I'm going to be talking about work from my dissertation research, but also it's integrated in some ways with the work that I'm now doing in my postdoctoral fellowship. I'd like to thank both sides of that equation at the outset. I'd like to thank my supervisors, Richard Cavell, Adam Frank, and Mark Vesey. And I would also like to thank the Electronic Textuals Cultures Lab team and my supervisor there, Ray Siemens. Now, yes, George Woodcock. He was a professor in English at this university during the long 60s, the founding editor of the journal Canadian Literature from 1959, and that was a journal that contributed to the transformation of the Canadian cultural landscape during the 60s. And he's also known internationally as a historian and theorist of anarchism. He hasn't been discussed much in research, scholarly research over the last 30 years. He's been kept in the Canadian cultural imagination largely through the efforts of writers here on the West Coast. George Featherling wrote an excellent biography. Alan Twigg of BC Book World has done a lot of work to ensure that Woodcock and his legacy are remembered. And also the journal Canadian Literature, editors such as Bill New and Marjorie Fee have done also a lot of work to preserve his memory. But when I took up this topic, and it was a topic that I came to through a fascination with Canadian literature as a whole during that period, I didn't really have too much currently within the literature to engage with, and I really, in a sense, had to start from scratch and contend with the entire oeuvre on my own terms, and to try to develop, with the help of my supervisors who collaborated with me on this, terms and ways of approaching what is a very eclectic and challenging body of work. Now, by the end, and this is what my research suggests, is that geographical and intellectual mobility was essential to Woodcock's part in the development of Canadian culture during the 60s, and as an architect of a cosmopolitan transnational literature that challenged and transcended status Cold War interventions in Canadian culture. This was an event put on by Canadian Literature for George Woodcock's 50th. This was a year ago. You can see Margaret Atwood and Marjorie Fee and others showing, I think, that Woodcock is coming back, which is great. He was the most prolific writer on Canadian culture during the 1960s and 70s. He became, at his ascendance, Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, member of the Royal Geographical Society, offered the Order of Canada, but he declined it for its feudalist associations, received 5 doctoral degrees. Towards the end of his life, he was awarded Freedom of the City, Vancouver's highest civil honor. But following this rise, he fell into, I guess, neglect, largely through, I guess, the neo-nationalism that arose in the 1970s, the thematic criticism that was associated with that politics that became central to the teaching of Canadian literature. Woodcock was a federalist, but not a nationalist, and anticipated and worked against nationalistic and I guess centralist approaches to involvement in the arts, and also nationalist approaches to understanding literature. So my work tries to see Woodcock's oeuvre within larger global social and political currents that emerged during the long 60s, and the Cold War was part of that. There have been reevaluations of Canadian critics of that period, specifically Marshall McLuhan and Northrop Frye in recent years. They've been recovered, and I thought that Woodcock would probably, or might be, someone that could sit alongside those two as one of the most significant critics and theorists within the Canadian landscape. Both Frye and McLuhan have been associated with the Toronto School of Communication. Currently, one of the projects that I'm working on at the ETCL is something called Eat Your Community. This is with under the direction of William Bowen. It's a project to develop a community interface and also a development site for projects for early modernists and for scholars of the Renaissance. This is Vancouver in 1947. Is that Granville Street? Yeah. This is the Vancouver that Woodcock arrived to when he came to Canada after leaving the London literary scene. Woodcock's first book on Canada was a travel book. Talked about Vancouver in rather disparaging terms. There was really nothing of cultural value, really. This was before the. This is according to Woodcock's book. This is before the Massey Commission and before a lot of the initiatives were put in place to bring Canadian culture into play. Woodcock, his early interest, he first moved to Vancouver Island. He was more interested in indigenous cultures, connected to his involvements with surrealism in England. He had connections in Europe, not only to the surrealist movement, but to the anarchist movement as well. It was through the modernist critic Hiebert. And what my dissertation attempts to do is to explore some of those connections that he maintained even after his arrival in Canada, and see how they play out with his involvements in Canadian culture. He also traveled extensively after his arrival in Canada. Spent a lot of time in India, Southeast Asia, China, Peru, Mexico. And these involvements also affected the thinking and the work that he did around Canadian culture. Now, Canadian literature during the 1960s was itself very transnational. This was the group of poets were at the 1963 Vancouver Poetry Festival conference that celebrated, the anniversary was celebrated, 50th anniversary was celebrated this past summer. These are poets that came up. There's American poets that came up associated with the Beat movement and San Francisco Renaissance. Black Mountain poets came up here and very much influenced the poets that would form so-called Tisch group I think you have Allen Ginsberg in the middle there. UBC actually bought Ginsberg a plane ticket to get him here from India so that he could teach his course here. Ginsberg had spent about a year in India. He had met the Dalai Lama. In fact, offered him LSD. The Dalai Lama politely declined. Woodcock had met the Dalai Lama 2 years before. In the 50s, Ginsberg actually came up here to consult with Woodcock about a poem he had written called Howl, which is regarded as one of the founding poems of postmodern American poetry. Woodcock thought it sounded like a noisy non-poem, didn't think highly of it at all. But the connection it shows just that Woodcock's work, in fact, had come to, had been received in the American scene. In the 1940s, he was known to poets there. He was also known before he came to Canada in New York and was taken up in the work of, within the writings of a group of people called the New York Intellectuals. So there are these transnational currents that my research tries to explore in order to understand how they played out in the formation of Canadian culture. So this is a picture of the George Woodcock display in the Kerner Library. You can get a sense of how many books he wrote. 130 altogether or so. He also, of course, wrote hundreds of articles for Canadian literature and other journals. And he dabbled in multimedia as well. One of his final projects was a contribution to a CD-ROM on Louis Riel. He made television documentaries, and he was also, when he first came to Canada, he became a radio broadcaster and radio dramatist. He wrote 30 radio dramas. So it was a very large body of work to contend with. This is one of the reasons. It's just a practical and methodological, I guess, reason for why Woodcock's work perhaps hasn't been as readily approached as some other critics. It's a lot of different subject areas that he dealt with, and just a lot of material. He also had involvements that extended into worlds outside of what we associate with literature and culture. He founded Canadian India Village Aid after his first trip to India in the early 60s. It's still operating today. Tibetan Refugee Aid Society, also still helping today. He also was involved in the Writers' Trust of Canada, donated his estate and Ingeborg Woodcock's estate to support writers in financial need. Also, his papers are scattered. He has his archives at Queen's, but he also has papers in archives here on the West Coast, and also at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. I found some open source software called New Radio through, I was pointed to it through Lynn Siemens, whose project management course I took at Culture and Technology Institute at Leipzig. I actually had a Gantt chart a couple of slides back ago for the ITER project that I should credit her for, her teaching for. But New Radio is a software that was first developed by John Soklovsky and a few other people. John Soklovsky is at Acadia University. So I just kind of messed around with the code and started putting the Woodcock, I guess, metadata into it to visualize. Try to visualize it in different ways. Break it up into different sort of organizational categories, and also I could just have it automatically visualize things in terms of time. So I'm now working with John Soklovsky on a consultative basis the redevelopment of New Radio. It's based on HTML5, and there's an open meta adapter that allows connection to all sorts of different databases, basically anything. So we can visualize archives in really new, interesting ways, and there's been a lot of tweaks made to the interface. So this is an exciting project that I'm also working on. I developed this site during the course of my research, georgewoodcock.ca, and I had also modified some code called Bebop, open source software for displaying BibTeX data. I modified it to just present XML data, but it was also a way of displaying the works in different ways, and also automating through XSLT links to resources on the internet. So, here, George Woodcock, Ingeborg, and the Dalai Lama. I also traveled a lot during my PhD. I spent, I guess, almost a year in sort of mobility, following the trail of Woodcock. This is where he first met the Dalai Lama. I'm going to mess up the pronunciation. I forget. Namgyal Monastery. That's where the Dalai Lama resides. I think everything would be the same, but I don't think the boxes of cookies would have been there back in 1961. Okay. Here's Woodcock to the left. Herbert Reed, George Orwell, Mulkraj Anand, a couple of other poets. This is the world that Woodcock brought with him, and which I trace. He was part of a modernist scene that hasn't been particularly documented very well. I'm writing an entry for the Routledge Encyclopedia of Modernism on Denise Levertov, who who published in Now, but also and came over to the United States around the same time as Woodcock. She's British-born. But looking through the available entries, a lot of the writers that are in Now just aren't listed, aren't going to be part of what's a very exciting and important project. And I'm not saying that they should be, just because a lot of this research is new, but I think it points to the fact that when you're dealing with writers that are in between worlds, they can in some sense become lost, and actually exploring and uncovering those writers and what they've contributed can tell us something new about each of the worlds that they're engaging with. So I'll just skip ahead. I only have 3 minutes. I have this title, I have cosmopolitanism in the title. Woodcock himself, he gradually gave up sort of the universalist understandings of cosmopolitanism that he derived primarily through Herbert Reed. He developed a very regional consciousness in coming to Canada. He understood culture as very much geographically situated within specific places and within specific cultural histories, and understood culture as, in some way, the interplay of various input, various cultural trends, meeting and engaging with the physical and cultural history or reality of a given place. And that's something that my dissertation has termed regional cosmopolitanism. As a form of critique, it promotes geographically situated cultural interplay to challenge territorial and non-territorial forms of imperialism. And so thinking about Woodcock and his contribution, we get a sense of Canadian culture as being more than just the sort of statist, nationalistic-driven, impinging force that some more recent criticism has helpfully explained to us, but it's also a force that spoke back through the benefit of contributions from other worlds. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Questions? Yes.
I was a member of the editorial board of the Queen's Quarterly.
Okay.
And Woodcock wrote a lot for us. And one of the most wearying things in those pre-digital days was to be on an editorial board which was dedicated to sending off authors. So we would be there tussling with all this paper that came not naturally to be converted into authors, and we would have to do that. And George would always write these angry letters back saying, don't send offers, send money. And I was like, that's an example of these dilemmas of the between two worlds, right? He was trying to buy spaghetti, and most of the people who were writing for us were wanting the offers to show their friends, to their children, and whatever. I add that because so often in this room, some people would offer these bits which you would praise them and say, that's data. So I often
that's interesting. There's a lot of his engagements too, and also the style that he wrote in, and he had sort of an edge to him that I think also has been retained within our thinking about Woodcock. That in some way it seems very out of sorts with I guess Canadian criticism today. He's not what we think of as an academic critic and writer, and so that's another reason I think why he hasn't been perhaps taken up so much by the scholarly community, and because anecdotes like that are also essential to understanding who he was and what he contributed to the Canadian scene.
Yes.
Did he study yoga? Because George Orwell and many of these others were often in here and involved with Vedanta societies.
He didn't study yoga. He did have a complex relationship with Buddhism. His wife Ingeborg studied Tibetan Buddhism. She studied the Tibetan language as well. She was I guess a practicing Buddhist. Woodcock contended with the ideas much more philosophically, in a more detached way, I guess. But you could say that they did come to affect his thinking. He was also very interested in the origins of religious thinking in general, and some of his historical work sought out connections between the very early thinking about in various religious traditions that emerged in India and their interrelationships with Western philosophy and how there was. Yeah. So he's not a typical case in that regard, but he was thinking along those lines as well. Yeah.
Yes.
I'd like to make a comment and then ask a question. It was really interesting. I worked with Amnesty International for some time, and founders of Amnesty International USA were also a poet, Joe Siren, who's still alive, and Whitney Brown or Whitney Ellsworth, who was the founder of the New York, founding publisher of the New York Review of Books. So there's this tradition, and then also three of the leading writers currently are strong supporters: Stephen King, J.K. Rowling, and the writers of Hunger Games. Suzanne Collins. So that was just to me interesting that there's this tradition, particularly with the girls as a poet. So my question is, did George Woodcock have an engagement with the CCF or the NDP or the origins of the Canadian healthcare system? Since Tommy Douglas was really prominent in that time.
It seems to be two parts to two very interesting things that you raised up. One is the connection between poetry and social activism. Woodcock did come out of, he was a late modernist, a very late modernist, what you might call a third-generation modernist. So after the Auden generation that sought to connect poetry with Marxist thinking, and to see poetry in some way as having involving a social imperative, social justice imperative. So Woodcock does come out of that tradition, and perhaps some of the other people that you mentioned might be thinking or might be working or connected to that tradition in some way. In regard to, I'm sorry, you'll have to remind me, actually, what was the second part of
The connection with business activity.
yeah, he didn't involve himself in Canadian politics. He was a critic of Canadian politics. He was a confederationalist, I guess you could say. He was drawn to the very early on to the thinking of Proudhon, which was an anarchist thinker who theorized the political model of the Confederation. That being said, the NDP and other groups in the 1970s were interested in Woodcock's thought. There was a volume of essays dedicated to him, taking up some of his proposals for how he thought Canada might become more of a decentralized, even more of a confederate, decentralized nation. And so different people like Ed Broadbent, for example, and others contended with his thinking. But of course, his ideas were not really implemented, I guess you could say.
Yes.
It was interesting to hear Woodcock's description of Howe as a noisy non-poem. And I suppose we can all correct that Ginsberg maybe didn't pay too much attention to that criticism. So I'm wondering what, if Woodcock consciously self-identified as a modernist, when new American poetry and poetics first appeared on the scene, prominently featuring Howe and one of its mid-20th century American poets with a consciously postmodern voice and the deliberate rejection of modernist form. Where did Woodcock situate himself in that? To come back to a between worlds kind of question. What did he think about the postmodernists?
Yeah, it's complex in that British poetry kind of fell apart by the end of the 30s after the Spanish Revolution, and even like the members of the Auden group kind of detached themselves from their own poetics. And then in the 40s, you have some experimentation that's represented in now, and new things that are starting to emerge, like sound poetry and concrete poetry are starting to actually seem to be, Woodcock seemed to be taking them seriously because he's editing this magazine. And yet, when he does return to Canada, when he actually starts taking an active role in massaging the poetry scene in Canada, he does seem to go back to traditional form, or he does seem to see value in traditional forms. Later on in his career, he stopped writing poetry when he came to Canada. He did some radio drama that had poetic elements. But later on in his career, he actually developed or started writing poetry again. And here his voice and his style is very different. It's much more what we would associate with a postmodern poetics. But at the same time, it's still very, I guess, visually oriented, not as much taking advantages of the affordances of sound, say, that the Tisch poets and the beat poets are associated with. So I would say that his later poetry is, in fact, postmodern, but of a very particular variant that's specific to him and to the scene here, if that makes sense.
Yes.
You suggested that he thought place was a really important thing. Mm-hmm. And my question is really, what effect did Vancouver have on him?
I would say it had a profound effect on him. It was the only place, actually, he felt that he could ever call home. He traveled extensively, always came back here. He had opportunities to live elsewhere, never did. Came to love Vancouver. All of the criticism that he regaled against the city earlier on in his career, by the end of it, through cultural developments in Canada, he could retract the things that he said. He was very much involved with the writers in Vancouver as well, and the artistic community, painters and so on, that shaped his work and whose work he shaped. So I think he's very much, I would say he's very much intertwined with Vancouver culture, and it's almost, at the end of the day, inseparable. An understanding of him is inseparable from that element as well. Yeah.
Any further questions? Yes.
That was wonderful talk. George Woodcock co-authored 2 books of the colleague of mine in history. I found
Hiebert who died this year.
Yes.
And I was wondering how common that was. They were both, one was biographical, and the other was on the food wars.
Right.
Historical work, and I wondered how common that was.
It was unique. Their relationship was unique, and Woodcock tended to write alone. The first book that he wrote with Abakumovich was on Peter Kropotkin, the anarchist prince, and then they did this study of the Doukhobors together. Woodcock actually helped facilitate Abakumovich's position here at UBC. In the end, though, this is something Featherling seems to suggest in his biography, that they had some sort of falling out, which is unfortunate. But they had an uncommon and a very productive working relationship early on in their career.
Okay, why don't we give a hand to Heather, Ari, and Matthew.